this idea that he has for replacing our economy with something else, where did it come from? Well, it actually isn't new. It's a repackaged idea that he's simply bringing to the surface again. And it's actually, so you know how we've talked about, this is going to be a little tangential, but I think it's important. You know how I talk all the time incessantly about the administrative state and how the administrative state came to being or came to fruition. It reared its ugly head a lot recently, but the ideas for this were brought to the public, if you will, or became popular under Woodrow Wilson in the 1920s. But when the ideas themselves were introduced in the 1920s by Woodrow Wilson, it didn't take hold. This wasn't a transformative thing that happened when Woodrow Wilson introduced it. It wasn't until FDR and LBJ and their New Deal and Great Society programs that the idea of the administrative state that had been introduced just philosophically by Woodrow Wilson came to fruition. That being said, you've heard me say that probably 10 times by now. That being said, this is actually very similar, the Great Reset. So this idea for the Great Reset is coming to fruition now, or they are attempting to bring it to fruition, but it's not philosophically a new idea. It's actually a repackaging of an old idea from the 1940s, believe it or not, under FDR. The man that wrote the New Deal under FDR, his name is Stuart Chase, he introduced this idea of dismantling our free market capitalist system and introducing what he called a managerial state, where, again, it's not that the state owns all the means of production and distribution. It's not that there's a collectivist or a collective ownership either. It's that the state just controls everything, which, I mean, you can argue that that's ownership, but the technicality is the important thing here. So Stuart Chase called this System X. He didn't have a clever name. I mean, that sounds like something you would get out of a Bond film. So I don't think that's a very clever name, but he didn't ask me. I wasn't born then. This Great Reset is basically a repackaged System X, which is important to understand because this has been an idea that's been planted in the intellectual elite or the leftist intellectuals for the last almost 100 years now. And if you look at some of the characteristics that Stuart Chase wrote about System X, then you'll see like, oh yeah, that's exactly what the left is trying to do right now. So these are some of the characteristics. I'm not going to read all of them. You can just Google it yourself, look up Stuart Chase's. It's a whole book that he wrote, but it is worth it if you want to understand it. These are a few of the characteristics of System X. A strong centralized government. An executive arm growing at the expense of the legislative and judicial arms. In some countries, power is consolidated in a dictator. Control of banking, underwriting of employment by the government, underwriting of social security by the government, underwriting of food by the government, abandonment of gold, control of natural resources, control of energy sources, control of transportation, control of agriculture and labor organizations, heavy taxation, and state control of communications, essentially a propaganda arm. So you see all this and you're like, oh, bam, mind blown. This is exactly what, well, the Great Reset is. The Great Reset doesn't advocate for a violent takeover or an immediate brutal dictatorship. They don't advocate bluntly for Marxism or socialism or capitalism, but they do advocate for all of these things that defined System X. They advocate for all of these things to happen so that they can control every aspect of our society. It will ultimately be authoritarianism or fascism.